I knew something was wrong before anything actually broke. Emily said, "You're imagining things," when I asked why she took hours to reply. I said, "I'm not accusing you," but my chest felt tight. She smiled at her phone and said, "It's just work," and I nodded even though I didn't believe it. At dinner I asked, "Why are you late again?" She shrugged. "Don't start." I said, "I'm not starting, I'm asking." She replied, "You always overthink," and the word always stayed with me. I told myself she was right. I told myself love meant trust. Later that night I said, "Who were you texting?" She laughed softly. "No one important," she said, turning the screen away. I said, "Okay," and hated how small my voice sounded. In my head I kept saying, "Calm down, don't ruin this." The next day she said, "I'm meeting an old friend." I asked, "From where?" She hesitated, then said, "From college." I said, "Do I know him?" She said, "His name is Ryan." The name landed heavy. "Your first love?" I asked. She looked at me and said nothing. That silence answered everything. That evening I finally met him. He smiled and said, "So you're the guy." I said, "I guess I am." Emily laughed too quickly. Ryan said, "It's been years," and Emily said, "Too many years." I watched her eyes soften, the way they used to with me. Ryan asked, "You don't mind me being around, right?" I said, "Why would I?" Emily touched my arm and said, "He's just staying for a while." I said, "How long is a while?" She replied, "I don't know," and looked at him instead of me. On the walk home I said, "You were different tonight, remember?" She said, "You're jealous." I said, "I'm scared." She sighed and said, "Ryan is important to my past." I asked, "What about your present?" She didn't answer. Before bed she said, "Ryan will be around more often." I forced a smile and said, "That's fine." Inside, something cracked, quietly, like a glass no one noticed breaking. That night I whispered, "Do you still want this?" She said, "Why are you asking now?" I said, "Because I feel you slipping." She turned away and said, "You're being dramatic." I said, "Tell me I'm wrong." She stayed quiet, and the quiet hurt more than shouting. The next morning I said, "Did I do something?" She said, "No," I asked, "Then why do I feel replaced?" She snapped, "Stop competing with ghosts." I said, "He's not a ghost if he's here." She grabbed her keys and said, "I'm late." I watched her leave and said, "We need to talk tonight." She replied, "We'll see." That answer followed me all day. At work I texted, "I love you." She replied hours later, "Busy." I stared at the screen and said to myself, "Hold it together." When she finally came home I asked, "Where were you?" She said, "Out." I asked, "With him?" She said, "Why does it matter?" I said, "Because I'm still considered your boyfriend." She looked tired and said, "Don't make this harder." I nodded and said, "Okay." But inside I knew the day everything felt wrong had already changed me forever. I lay awake thinking, this is the beginning. I didn't know of what, but I felt it. I told myself tomorrow I would speak, or walk away, because pretending nothing was wrong was slowly destroying me. I breathed, waited, listened to silence, and understood trust was breaking, quietly, without warning, right inside my chest. I noticed Lily first. She texted, "Hey, are you awake?" at midnight. I replied, "Everything okay?" She sent a laughing emoji and said, "Just bored." I stared at the screen and thought, why is Emily's friend texting me this late? The next day Sophie said, "You've been working out, right?" I laughed and said, "Not really." She replied, "Emily doesn't appreciate you enough." I said, "She does," but my stomach felt strange saying it. Megan added me on social media and messaged, "You seem misunderstood." I typed, deleted, then wrote, "What do you mean?" Lily said, "We are just checking on you." I asked, "Why?" She replied, "Because you deserve honesty." I said, "About what?" She avoided the question and sent a selfie instead. I looked away from my phone and told myself, "Don't be stupid." That night Emily barely spoke to me. I said, "You're quiet." She said, "Tired." I asked, "Want to talk?" She said, "Not now." 10 minutes later Lily texted, "She ignores you a lot, doesn't she?" I typed, "You shouldn't say that." Lily replied, "I'm just being real." Sophie messaged, "If you were mine, I'd listen." I felt heat rush to my face. I said, "You're crossing a line." She answered, "Am I, or are you just scared?" I locked my phone and paced the room. I kept thinking, why are they doing this now? The next day Megan asked, "Are you happy?" I said, "Why do you care?" She replied, "Because Emily takes you for granted." I said, "You don't know our relationship." She answered, "We know more than you think." That line stayed with me. I confronted Emily and said, "Your friends keep messaging me." She looked calm and said, "So?" I said, "It's weird." She shrugged and said, "They like you." I asked, "Does that not bother you?" She said, "Should it?" Her eyes felt cold. Later Lily texted, "She doesn't deserve your loyalty." I replied, "Stop." Lily said, "Why?" I typed, "Because I love her." She sent, "Love doesn't mean blind." I didn't respond. I should have blocked her then, but I didn't. Sophie joked, "If you ever get lonely, we are here." I said, "This isn't funny." She replied, "Relax, we are adults." Megan asked, "Has she been honest with you?" I asked, "What are you implying?" She said, "Nothing, just asking." Emily grew more distant. When I asked, "Did I do something wrong?" she said, "You're exhausting." That word hurt. Minutes later Lily said, "See." I felt like I was being pushed from both sides. One night Lily said, "If I were your girlfriend, I wouldn't test you." I froze and asked, "Test me how?" She paused, then wrote, "Forget it." My heart started improving pieces together. I asked, "Is this a game?" She replied, "Depends how you play." I told myself, don't cross any lines. I never flirted back. I never sent pictures. But I also didn't shut it down completely. I listened. I read. I stayed silent. Part of me wanted to understand why this was happening. Megan finally said, "Emily wants to know if you're loyal." I stared at the words and felt sick. I replied, "Is this a test?" She answered, "Would you pass?" I said, "This is wrong." She said, "Then prove it." I looked at my phone and whispered, "Why would she do this?" Emily came home late and said, "What's wrong with you?" I said, "Ask your friends." She frowned and said, "Don't blame them." I realized then I wasn't being tempted. I finally understood the game when Megan texted, "So, did you fail yet?" I typed, "Fail what?" She replied, "You're smarter than that." My hand shook as I said out loud, "This is a test." The word tasted bitter. I didn't feel tempted. I felt insulted. I messaged Lily and said, "Did Emily ask you to do this?" She replied, "Why would you think that?" I said, "Because nothing else makes sense." She didn't answer for a long time. Then she said, "Just be honest with yourself." That was enough. My chest burned with anger. I sat alone and whispered says, "She doesn't trust me." I replayed every moment in my head. Emily growing distant. Her friends getting close. Ryan returning. I said, this was planned. Instead of confronting her, I made a choice. I decided to stay calm. I decided to watch. Sophie texted, "You're quiet tonight." I replied, "Just tired." She said, "Emily doesn't even notice, does she?" I answered, "Stop." She replied, "Why? Afraid you'll say something real." I didn't flirt. I didn't cross lines. But I let them talk. Emily grew colder by the day. When I asked, "Are we okay?" she said, "You're overreacting." I asked, "Do you still care?" She said, "Why are you like this lately?" Her answers felt rehearsed. Ryan's name came up more often. My name came up less. One evening I heard her on the phone. She said, "Just keep watching him." I froze behind the door. She continued, "If he slips, I need to know." My stomach dropped. I walked away before she saw me. I felt small, tested, reduced to a risk. That night I confronted Lily and said, "You're spying on me." She replied, "If you're loyal, why does it matter?" I said, "Because trust shouldn't be proven this way." She said, "Then pass the test." I stared at the screen and felt something inside me die. I asked myself, is this what love is? I remembered how I defended Emily to everyone. I remembered choosing her every day without question. I felt foolish. Still, I stayed silent. I wanted to see how far she would go. Megan said, "Emily thinks you're weak." I replied, "Why would you say that?" She answered, "Because you haven't complained." Sophie added, "Ryan never would have accepted this." That name hit me hard. I realized the test wasn't about loyalty. It was comparison. Emily stopped asking about my day. When I said, "You feel far," she replied, "You're imagining it." When I said, "Ryan seems close," she snapped, "Don't be insecure." Her words felt sharp, like she wanted me to break. One afternoon I heard her laugh on the phone. She said, "He hasn't done anything." Then she said, "Good." I knew she was talking about me. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was calm. That hurt more. I messaged Lily and said, "I know everything." She replied, "Then why stay?" I said, "Because I've done nothing wrong." She said, "Emily won't see it that way." I replied, "That's her choice." My hands felt steady for the first time. From that moment, I saved everything. Every message. Every screenshot. Every late-night question. I didn't know why. I just felt I would need proof. Not for her. For myself, clarify reality, later truth soon, and proof instinct stayed alive. I knew something was wrong the moment Emily said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, "Tell you what?" She held up my phone and said, "Don't play dumb." My stomach dropped. I said, "You went through my phone." She shouted, "Answer the question." I said, "Those chats mean nothing." She laughed sharply and said, "Nothing." I said, "I never crossed a line." She yelled, "You let them flirt with you." I replied, "I shut it down." She screamed, "Not fast enough." I tried to stay calm and said, "You sent them." She froze and said, "What?" I said, "You asked them to test me." Her face changed. She said, "That's not the point." I said, "That is the only point." She started crying and said, "You enjoyed the attention." I said, "No, I felt insulted." She pointed at the screen and said, "Then why didn't you block them?" I said, "Because I wanted to understand why my girlfriend didn't trust me." She yelled, "Don't twist this on me." I said, "You twisted it first." She paced the room and said, "You humiliated me." I asked, "How?" She said, "My friends saw you as an option." I replied, "Because you told them to." She covered her ears and said, "Stop." I said, "You don't want truth." She snapped, "You betrayed me." I laughed, bitter and tired, and said, "By staying loyal." She screamed, "By entertaining them." I said no every time. She shouted, "But you stayed." That sentence hit harder than anything else. She sat down and cried, "Ryan would never do this." I said, "Ryan isn't you." She looked up and said, "Ryan never had to be tested." I said, "Then why am I?" She didn't answer. Her silence screamed guilt. She started listing names and said, "Lily said you replied. Sophie said you joked. Megan said you listened." I said, "Listening isn't cheating." She yelled, "It is when you hide it." I said, "I didn't hide. You never asked." She slammed the table and said, "You made me feel stupid." I said, "You made me feel disposable." She said, "You could have walked away." I said, "So could you." She screamed. I was confused. I said, so I deserved punishment. She looked at me with red eyes and said, I hate you right now. Those words broke something in me. I said quietly, you don't hate me. She yelled, I hate what you did. I replied, I hate what you assumed. She started crying harder and said, I gave you everything. I said, except trust. She shouted, trust has to be earned. I said, I earned it every day until you doubted me. She covered her face and said, you made me insecure. I said, no, Ryan did. She looked Ramines and screamed, don't say his name. I said, you say it every day. She yelled, because he understands me. I said, then why am I here? She had no answer. I felt myself stop begging. I said, I'm done explaining. She shouted, so you admit it. I said, I admit I won't fight for someone who tests me. She said, you're giving up. I said, I'm waking up. She cried and said, say you're sorry. I said, I'm sorry you don't trust me. She screamed, that's not an apology. I said, it's the only one I have. She turned away and said, get out of my sight. I picked up my jacket and said, this ended when you chose suspicion over love. She shouted, don't act innocent. I said, I am innocent. She laughed and said, you're just like the rest. That hurt, but I didn't react. As I walked away, I realized love without trust was already dead. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt empty. And in that emptiness, I knew I would never. I packed my bag without saying a word. Emily stood in the doorway and said, so that's it. I said, I don't know what else to do. She crossed her arms and said, you're really leaving. I said, you already left. She didn't reply. Silence filled the room, heavy and final. I picked up my keys and said, I'll come back for the rest later. She said, don't bother. I nodded and said, okay. My voice sounded empty. I walked out without slamming the door. I wanted peace, not drama. Outside, my phone buzzed. Lily texted, did she kick you out? I blocked her. Sophie called. I declined. Megan sent, we tried to help. I blocked her too. I blocked everyone connected to her. I needed quiet more than explanations. That night I sat alone and said out loud, what did I do wrong? No one answered. I replayed every message, every conversation. I asked myself, was I too patient? I blamed myself for not walking away sooner. I blamed myself for staying silent. The apartment felt cold. I said, this hurts, and let the words exist. I didn't cry loudly. I just sat and breathed. I remembered Emily laughing with me once. I remembered promising her forever. I asked, was I never enough? My phone rang again. It was Daniel. He said, you disappeared. I said, I needed space. He replied, I'm outside. I opened the door and he said, you look wrecked. I said, I feel hollow. He nodded and said, that means you cared. We sat in silence. Then says, did you cheat? I said, no, he said, then why are you punishing yourself? I said, because she made me feel guilty anyway. He said, that's not love. I stared at the floor and said, I know. He asked, are you eating? I said, not really. He said, come stay with me for a bit. I shook my head and said, I need to be alone. He said, alone is fine, but don't disappear. I said, I'll try. Days passed. I woke up, went to work, came back, and slept. I avoided mirrors. I avoided memories. When I heard her name, my chest tightened. I said, just breathe, again and again. Daniel called one night and said, tell me something good about yourself. I laughed bitterly and said, I don't know. He said, you stayed loyal when you were tested. I said, that didn't save anything. He said, it saved you. I thought about that. I said, I still feel like I failed. He replied, you didn't fail the relationship. The relationship failed you. I went quiet. Those words felt heavy but true. One evening I almost texted Emily. I typed, "I miss you," then deleted it. I said to myself, missing her doesn't mean going back. I put the phone down and sat with the pain instead. I started walking at night, just to feel air. I said, "I'm still here." It wasn't brave. It was survival. Some nights I whispered, "I loved you," and let it hurt. Daniel checked in again and said, "You don't need revenge." I said, "I don't want it." He said, "Good. Heal first." I nodded even though he couldn't see me. Weeks later, I stood alone and said, "I didn't deserve that." Saying it out loud felt strange. I said it again. I didn't deserve that. Something loosened in my chest. I made a promise to myself that night. I said, I will never let anyone test my loyalty again. I said, if someone doubts me, they lose me. I didn't feel strong. I told myself, just keep moving, every morning. At my new job, my manager said, "You're learning fast." I replied, "I'm trying." It felt good to hear something positive again. When coworkers asked, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah," and this time it wasn't a lie. Daniel called and said, "You sound different." I asked, "Good different or tired different?" He laughed and said, "Stronger different." I smiled and said, "I'm breathing again." That mattered more than happiness. One evening Sophie messaged from a new number. She said, "I know you block me." I replied, "Why are you here?" She said, "Ryan left Emily." I stared at the words and said nothing. Sophie added, "He went back overseas." I replied, "That's not my business." She said, "Emily's a mess." I typed, "I hope she's okay," and meant it, which surprised me. Sophie replied, "She keeps blaming everyone." I said, "That sounds familiar." I didn't ask for more. Later Megan messaged and said, "People are talking." I replied, "About what?" She said, "About how she tested you." I felt my chest tighten. I said, "I didn't tell anyone." Megan answered, "Truth leaks on its own." Daniel said, "You hear anything new?" I replied, "Only rumors." He said, "You staying out of it?" I said, "Completely." He said, "Good. Let karma do the work." I didn't know if I believed in karma before, but I was starting to listen. A week later Lily texted, "I'm sorry." I replied, "For what?" She said, "For letting Emily use us." I typed, "That's between you and her." She said, "She's pushing us away now." I answered, "I can't help." At work, a coworker said, "You seem lighter." I said, "I dropped something heavy." She smiled and said, "Good choice." I realized I wasn't checking my phone every minute anymore. Silence didn't scare me now. Daniel asked, "Do you feel bad for her?" I said, "Sometimes." He asked, "Do you feel relieved?" I paused and said, "Also yes." He said, "Both can exist." I nodded and said, "That makes sense." I heard more without trying. Someone said, "Emily quit her job." Someone else said, "Her friends stopped answering." I didn't react. I just listened and let the information pass through me without staying. One night Emily called. I stared at the screen and whispered, "Not yet." I let it ring out. My heart raced, but I didn't panic. I told myself, I don't owe immediate access to anyone. Daniel said, "That was growth." I said, "It felt strange." He replied, "Strange is better than broken." I laughed softly and said, "True." I ran into Ryan by accident at a cafe. He said, "Hey." I said, "Hey." He said, "No hard feelings." I replied, "None." He looked uncomfortable and said, "Emily complicated things." I said, "She did." He nodded and left. I didn't feel anger. I felt done. That night I said out loud, "I survived." The words felt real. I wasn't celebrating her downfall. I wasn't cheering. I was simply standing, still intact. Emily texted, "Everything is falling apart." I replied, "I hope you find peace." She said, "You sound cold." I typed, "I sound healed." She didn't respond. Daniel asked, "Do you feel free?" I looked around my quiet room and said, "Yes." Not because she was hurting, but because I wasn't anymore. I realized karma didn't shout. It whispered. And for the first time, I was listening, calmly, without fear, finally choosing myself over chaos. I was leaving work when Emily said, "Please wait." I turned and said, "We shouldn't do this here." She said, "Then tell me where." I sighed and said, 5 minutes. My voice didn't shake. She sat across from me and said, "I ruined everything." I said, "You made choices." She said, "I was scared." I replied, "Fear doesn't excuse cruelty." She nodded and said, "I know." She looked at me and said, "I tested you." I said, "I know." She said, "I asked my friends to tempt you." I said, "I know." She said, "I watched every move." I replied, "I felt it." She cried and said, "Ryan came back and I panicked." I said, "You wanted both worlds." She said, "I didn't want to lose either." I answered, "So you tried to control me?" She whispered, "Yes." She said, "I thought if you failed, it would hurt less." I said, "You were preparing to blame me." She said, "I hate that you're right." I said, "I hated being doubted." She reached for my hand and said, "I'm sorry." I pulled back and said, "Don't." She asked, "Why not?" I said, "Because apologies don't erase damage." She cried harder and said, "I deserve that." She said, "I pushed Ryan away too." I replied, "I know." She said, "He left when things got real." I said, "That's who he always was." She looked down and said, "I see that now." She said, "I lost my friends." I said, "They were never yours." She said, "I lost you." I said, "You gave me away." She whispered, "I know." She asked, "Do you hate me?" I paused and said, "No." She looked hopeful and said, "Then there's a chance." I said, "No." Her face fell. She said, "I'll do anything." I said, "You already did." She said, "I'll rebuild trust." I replied, "Trust isn't rebuilt after it's weaponized." She said, "So this is punishment?" I said, "This is consequence." She cried and said, "You're so calm." I said, "I healed." She said, "I wanted you to fight." I said, "I fought enough alone." She said, "I didn't know." I said, "You didn't want to know." She said, "I was afraid you'd leave." I answered, "You pushed me out." She said, "I see that now." I said, "Seeing it late doesn't change the past." She asked, "Can you forgive me?" I said, "I can forgive you." She breathed out and smiled weakly. I continued, "But forgiveness doesn't mean access." Her smile faded. She said, "So what do we do?" I said, "We let go." She shook her head and said, "I can't." I said, "You will." She said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because I did." She looked at me and said, "You're different." I said, "I had to be." She said, "I broke you." I said, "You changed me." She asked, "Is that worse?" I said, "It's final." She stood up and said, "I hope you're happy." I said, "I hope you find peace." She said, "You deserve better." I said, "I chose better." She paused and said, "If I hadn't tested you." I interrupted and said, "We don't live in what ifs." She nodded and said, "Goodbye." I said, "Goodbye." She turned back once and said, "Was any of it real?" I answered, "My love was real." She asked, "Then why does this hurt so much?" I said, "Because truth hurts when it arrives late." She wiped her face and said, "I wish I was stronger." I replied, "Strength starts with honesty." She said, I thought control meant safety. I said, control destroys safety. She nodded slowly and said, I learned the wrong lesson. I said, you learned it the hard way. She asked, did you ever think of staying? I said, I thought of surviving. She said, you don't need me anymore. I said, I never needed fear. She whispered, I needed reassurance. I said, you needed to trust. She closed her eyes and said, I failed. I said, you did. She stepped closer and said, this is the last time I'll see you. I said, yes. She asked, does that scare you? I said, no, she said, it scares me. I replied, fear is yours now. She took a deep breath and said, I hope someone loves me again. I said, I hope you love yourself first. She nodded and said, that's fair. I said, take care. She said, you too. I watched her leave without chasing. My heart stayed steady. I didn't feel powerful. I sat alone and said, I don't need answers anymore. The words felt strange but honest. I opened my phone and saw Emily's name still there. I whispered, this ends now, and deleted the last thread. My chest tightened, then eased. Daniel called and said, did you talk to her again? I replied, yes. He asked, how do you feel? I said, clear. He paused and said, that's better than angry. I agreed. I told myself, forgiveness is not access. I repeated it until it stayed. I didn't need her apology to heal. I needed distance. I needed respect for myself. I opened a drawer and found her sweater. I said, this isn't mine anymore. I folded it carefully and placed it in a bag. Returning it wasn't kindness to her. It was closure for me. At work, Sarah said, you seem calmer lately. I said, I chose quiet. She smiled and said, that's rare. I replied, it's necessary. There was no tension, no games. Just ease. Later she asked, do you believe people can change? I said, only when they want to. She nodded and said, that's honest. The conversation felt light. I didn't feel pulled. I felt steady. That night Emily texted, can we talk again? I stared at the message and said, no, I typed, I wish you well, but please don't contact me again. I blocked the number before doubt could enter. I sat back and said, boundaries are not cruelty. Saying it out loud helped. I wasn't punishing her. I was protecting myself. Daniel messaged, proud of you. I replied, I finally believe I deserve peace. He said, you always did. I read that twice. I thought about forgiveness. I said, forgiveness frees me, not you. I didn't feel bitter. I felt complete enough to move forward without dragging the past. I cleared my gallery next. Photos disappeared one by one. I paused on one and said, you mattered once. Then I deleted it. My hands didn't shake. Sarah passed my desk and said, coffee. I said, sure. She asked, rough week? I answered, transformative. She laughed softly and said, I like that word. I did too. We talked about work, life, and boundaries. She said, healthy people don't test love. I smiled and said, I learned that the hard way. She said, still counts. There was no promise, just respect. When I got home, I opened the bag and returned Emily's things through a courier. I wrote no note. Silence was enough. I closed the door and felt lighter. I stood by the window and said, I choose myself. Not in anger. Not in fear. In calm certainty. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I remembered begging once. I said, never again. That wasn't bitterness. That was growth. I knew what I would accept and what I wouldn't. Daniel asked later, do you feel lonely? I said, sometimes. He said, is it better than before? I said, yes. He replied, then you're winning. I sat with that word. Winning didn't mean someone else lost. It meant I found myself again. Before sleeping, I I checked my phone. No messages. No anxiety. I whispered, "This is peace." It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and strong. I closed my eyes knowing I didn't need closure from someone who broke trust. I created my own by choosing dignity, boundaries, and self-respect. Tomorrow would come without her. And that... I stood in front of the mirror and said, "You survived." My reflection didn't look heroic. It looked calm. I said, "That's enough." I remembered who I was before everything and realized I wasn't that man anymore. I was stronger, quieter, and more aware. Daniel once asked, "Do you regret loving her?" I answered, "No," he said, "even after everything." I said, "Love wasn't the mistake. Doubting myself was." Saying that changed something inside me. I thought about Emily and said, "You were a lesson." Not a scar. Not a wound. A lesson. I didn't need to hate her to move on. I didn't need revenge to feel whole. I needed understanding, and I found it in myself. I remembered the nights I questioned my worth. I said, "Never again." I remembered staying loyal while being tested. I said, "That mattered." Even if she didn't see it, I did. And that was enough. Someone at work said, "You seem confident." I replied, "I trust myself now." They smiled and said, "That's rare." I thought about it later and realized it was true. Trust in myself was the real reward. I asked myself, what did betrayal teach me? The answer came easily. I said, boundaries are love. I said, trust should be given, not proven. I said, anyone who tests loyalty doesn't deserve it. I no longer replayed conversations in my head. I no longer wondered what I could have done differently. I said, I did my best with the truth I had. That truth gave me peace. Daniel said, you won quietly. I asked, did I? He said, you didn't lose yourself. That mattered more than any argument I could have won. I spoke to myself and said, you don't chase closure. I said, you create it. I had done that. I closed doors without slamming them. I walked away without destroying anything but illusions. I thought about the version of me who begged to be understood. I said, you deserved better. I wasn't ashamed of him. I was grateful. He showed me what I would never accept again. Sometimes I imagined Emily thinking about me. Not with anger. Not with regret. Just with understanding. But even if she didn't, it didn't matter anymore. My healing didn't depend on her growth. I said, justice doesn't have to be loud. It arrived quietly. She lost someone loyal. I found myself. That balance felt right. If someone asked me now, would you go through it again? I would pause and say, no, then I would add, but I'm thankful I learned. Pain taught me what comfort never could. I looked forward without fear. I trusted that healthy love wouldn't need tests. I trusted that the right person wouldn't question my loyalty. And if they did, I would leave without explaining. I said, I am not broken. I said, I am rebuilt. Brick by brick. Boundary by boundary. Truth by truth. I breathed deeply and said, this chapter is closed. Not with bitterness. With clarity. Betrayal didn't destroy me. It refined me. And the man I became after it was someone I finally respected, fully, honestly, and with